It's time to get wet and dirty. Today we step foot into the boggiest of swamps to discover the terrors that lurk there and the fates of those who witnessed the downright creepy. Enjoy these allegedly true scary stories that take place in swamps. Go to darkstories.org to send me your scary stories so I can narrate them. By the way, Carrion joins us today to read some stories, because I'm having some intermittent internet outages. She's the host of my other podcast, Freaky Folklore, where she explains the lore behind your favorite monsters and legends. Check it out on your favorite podcasting apps. Now, let's begin. Delta Frogman from SpartanMom. I used to work in EMS as an ambulance driver. It was grueling work, especially in the Delta of Mississippi. I've seen terrible things, funny things, and all in between. However, I've had some special experiences that will stand out as some of the most core-shaking things I've ever witnessed. Though it's not death that shakes me anymore, or new life, or even saving one, but witnessing a life form comparable to humans. So here is my story. One morning we get the call to transport a patient to Jackson. Everything is in order, the patient is loaded, and we're ready to get this over with. As per the norm, my paramedic partner is in the back with our patient and I'm driving. It gets pretty boring on a 2-hour trip, so I try to keep myself busy by taking in the sights of the fields and swamps we pass by. At one point we're passing through another swamp. It was pretty. I was looking ahead but letting my eyes wander over the eerie yet majestic beauty of it all. As we came around a bend in the road, I noticed something big perched on a guardrail. There was some fairly tall grass growing by the rail, so it was hard to see it clearly. At first I thought it was a garbage bag or something someone had placed up on the rail. However, I realized it wasn't a garbage bag because it was a creamy light green color, like the froth you see on the top of swamps, and it was moving right to left with the movement of the traffic in the other lane. As I got closer, I realized it looked like a huge bullfrog. It was roughly the size of a basketball, but for a frog the shape and color was all wrong. It was rounded like a human's head, and soon I got a look at its face as it turned and looked at me through the front windshield. Its eyes were huge, black, shiny orbs, positioned on the front of its face like a human's eyes would be. At this point, I started to slow my speed, and my mind was racing to understand what the heck kind of frog looks like this. The mouth was wide, stretching around its head but more downward than a frog's, and those eyes had a look to them that I can only compare to a human's. This thing was looking at me with puzzled eyes and studying my face, just as I was doing to it. I was upon this creature now, and it couldn't have been more than a few feet from me. That's when I noticed that it had no legs under it. It was just poking up over the rail. My mind was reeling through all the biology and zoology classes I'd ever taken, trying to understand what this thing was that was looking at me. At that moment, I was now seeing it through the passenger window, taking in every little detail. When it turned its head, it finally hit me. It was its head. I was only looking at the freaking head of this creature. This frog man was now looking at my ambulance, studying the side, almost like it was reading or trying to understand the symbolism on the side of it. As I passed the creature, I continued looking at it through the side view mirror. The creature's gaze followed my ambulance a little longer, before turning back and looking at the rest of the traffic going by. That's when I got a load of the actual size of this thing. It most definitely was just the head of the creature I saw. Now I could see its neck and continuation of what I knew had to be the rest of its body behind the guardrail. Now, to give you a better idea of the size of this guy, you would have to see the railing. This wasn't a small guardrail. I'm 5 foot 2 inches, and I know that rail was almost level with my ambulance window, and this thing's head was in my window. That means the rail had to come to just below or level with my shoulders. The other side of the rail was a steep slope, basically dropping off into the swamp. So that means this thing, to be standing and peeking over without straining, needed to be at least 7 feet tall. Now, after taking in all of this and reaching the end of this bend, I took one last look at the creature who was still watching the cars. I burned that image in my mind. Believe me or don't, I couldn't care less. Seeing that creature changed me. My way of thinking and looking at the world is no longer clouded with the wall of human logic. It hushed me. From You Will Never Know. This took place when I was 5 years old. I used to live near this swamp that always scared me, because I'd always see gators with glowing yellow eyes out there. One night I couldn't sleep. I was restless and felt uncomfortable, so I decided to head for the kitchen and hopefully find something to drink that would calm me down. I made my way downstairs, and as I did, I suddenly heard someone whispering, "Behave." I turned around, but there was no one there. I just ignored it. Probably just my imagination, I told myself. I made it to the kitchen, grabbed a glass of water, then headed back to my bedroom. Once again, I heard the whisper, but this time it sounded irritated. "Behave." I freaked out and ran back to my room. I covered myself with my blanket. A few seconds later, I took a look outside of my blanket, but there was no one there. I then looked out my window, and I saw a dark figure coming out of the swamp. My eyes began watering with fear as I see this figure looking at me with bright white eyes. Then it hushed me with its finger to its mouth. Then it headed back into the swamp. I was petrified. I didn't know what to do. Suddenly, the closet door opened, and there stood the same figure I had just looked at outside. It looked at me, and I closed my eyes, praying that this thing would leave me alone. When I opened my eyes, I saw him face to face. He smiled wide. He reached out a hand towards me. Then everything went black. When I woke up the next day, I was sweating profusely and felt pain across my forehead. I got up and went to the bathroom, and I saw a mark on my forehead, spelling out, "Behave." To this day, I have trouble sleeping, and even now at the age of 36, I sleep with the TV on. But that's not the end of this story. Over the next few days, I would cover that mark with my hair so that my parents didn't ask me how it happened. A week after that incident, I visited my grandmother's house. I arrived with my family, including my cousins, at night, and as we all sat next to the fireplace, my grandmother told us a story about the boogeyman. She said it was a creature that would roam around at night, taking the children that don't behave. As soon as she said that, I felt sick, but I held it in. Then she began singing an old song that she heard from her mother. The lyrics were, "Hurry, fall asleep, or the boogeyman will come for you from the swamps. He will come to take the children that don't behave." I still don't know if that really was the boogeyman or not, but whatever the case may be, that mark will forever change my view of this world. The Rougarou of Gibson Swamp, from Bullet 522071. Back in 2006, I was an adventurous teenager who loved to hunt, and I always went with my grandfather, who was in his late 50s at the time and had just fought off an infection. He was very weakened, and the first thing he told me was that he wanted to go hunting early the next morning. Around then, the local talk was that there was a band of coyotes roaming around the area, so I packed my .22 caliber Swiss pistol and a 12-gauge shotgun, just in case the tiny rascals tried doing anything stupid. So early next morning, I woke up around 5 a.m. I got dressed, and as I walked to my dirt bike, I heard an ear-ringing howl or screech coming from behind my house. At first, I thought it was a bobcat, until I made out that there was also a howl mixed in with it. So I quickly started my bike and drove to my grandpa's house and waited for him to get his truck keys. Then, together, we headed off into the area where I heard that howl or screech, because that happened to be the direction where our spot was. Once we get there, we get ready to trek off into our spot. While waiting, nearby I could hear coyotes, the ones everyone had been talking about. But this wasn't the typical coyote sound. Rather, they sounded like they were being attacked. My grandfather, being a very curious man, decided that we should go check it out. While on the way there, we heard an extra set of twigs snapping underfoot, almost at the same time as our own, as if a third person was with us, unseen. When we got to the site of the sounds of the coyotes, we found a disturbing scene. The poor animals had been thrashed. Some had been impaled on tree branches. Others had huge gashes from head to toe. Others had their heads or eyes ripped from their places. It was a disgusting sight. I wondered what type of person could do this. My grandfather looked at me one time and said, "Let's go." We started to speed walk back to the truck, but at a certain point my grandfather had to go take a leak. I turned the other way and waited for him to finish his business, when suddenly I see a shape running around in front of me. That's when I get the dumb idea of turning on the flashlight of my phone to get a better look. As soon as I did that, I saw this huge, masculine, humanoid-looking wolf thing coming directly at me, and I screamed. Keep in mind, I was no twig. I played football all my life as well as baseball, a bit of a submission specialist in boxing. That was me, and this abomination made me soil myself. I snapped out of my shock and picked up my gun. I pulled the trigger. There was a loud crackle of gunpowder, then the creature stopped. Slowly it looked at its chest, which was oozing red. Then it looked back at me, and either smiled or snarled, I can't be sure. Then I heard my grandfather come running towards me. Before he got to me, that thing looked at me, and I swear I heard it speak.
"Not a word. You'll be just like me."
After that, it ran back off into the swamps. We went home, and I called my grandmother. Not my grandfather's wife, but on my mother's side. I told her the whole story. She said she believed it to be the Rougarou, and that it's best I don't tell another soul, besides her, for another year. Because if I did, I would turn into the monstrous thing. The old folktale goes, he that sees the Rougarou and opens his mouth about it becomes it. But this happened over a decade ago, and I haven't heard about it for 13 years, because after all that time, I heard the howl screech again. Now I'm moving to a different state with my girlfriend, and hopefully I don't have to see that thing ever again, or hear it.
The Rougarou of Gibson, Louisiana, from Bryson. I grew up in Houma, Louisiana for most of my life with a family who grew up in the bayou, so snake bites and scars weren't uncommon in our house. But something that has stuck with me throughout my life is this near-death experience. I was out hunting with my dog Django looking for squirrels. So I loaded up in my 2002 Ford and drove towards the woods just off of the old Spanish road trail. I started off getting out Django's leash, and starting off I shot a few squirrels, Django going after them as soon as they fell out of the trees. I had made it about 1 mile in the woods when I noticed that the sun was starting to go down, so I started to set up my camp. Thankfully, I was in an area where there was a good breeze. It was bad for squirrels, but was good to keep mosquitoes away from you. So after a while, I started cleaning 2 of the 4 squirrels that I had, one for me and one for Django, and I put the parts that were bad in a bucket and go throw it out when I was done eating. So I started putting them on the open fire and started to set up my tent. Suddenly, the swamp had gone quiet. No bugs, no birds, and no wind. I had stopped and grabbed my .22 caliber Swiss pistol that I used for protection and aimed it at the sky and fired a shot. Now, most animals are scared of loud noises, and so if there was any predator in the area, it would be sure and run away. After a while, the swamp came back to life, so I knew that whatever it was gone. Fast forward to later that night. I was texting my then girlfriend, now fiancé, when Django scratches at the tent to be let in, so I let him in and decide to go to sleep and tell my girlfriend good night. I try to sleep after tossing and turning, but the swamp went silent again, and then I started hearing bipedal footsteps starting to walk towards the part of my camp where earlier I was cleaning the squirrels. I suddenly realized that I had forgotten to dump the squirrel remains. I heard the bucket get tilted, so I sat up and looked and saw an animal that looked like a wolf on 4 legs ripping into the pieces of discarded squirrel. Thinking it was a coyote for some stupid reason, I grabbed my gun and unzipped the tent. But before I could go do anything, Django flew out and jumped on the creature's back and started fighting it. So I hurry up and jump out and noticed that this thing was way bigger than I had thought, and I saw that it was bigger than I was. I am 6'5", and at the time I was a tight end for H.L. Borges High School. This thing was standing up, clawing at its back, trying to get my dog off of it, and had a good 2 feet on me. I aimed my pistol at the thing, and I opened fire on its stomach and chest, and it yelped and reached on its back, taking Django, throwing him against a tree, and then looked at me and growled a low, guttural growl. I now had a good look at it. It had black fur with patches missing. It had orange glowing eyes, and it was bleeding from its stomach, most likely where the bullets had hit. It charged me, tackling me to the ground, and went straight for my neck. I put my arm without the gun in the way. It bit on my arm and it squeezed and it shook its head. I was stunned by being tackled and now having my arm being ripped to shreds and was prepared to die when Django once again jumped on the thing and started biting the back of its neck. It roared and screeched at the same time. As soon as my arm was free, I raced back towards my tent and grabbed my 12 gauge that I had brought mainly to hunt squirrels, but now to kill this damn thing. I ran back out just in time to see this thing's claws impale Django and see my beloved dog go limp. Me, now filled with rage and pain from my wound, aimed the 12 gauge at its head and fired all 4 shots, each one hitting, and instead of it charging, it started running away. So I grabbed my pistol and started shooting at it until it reached the wood line. It fell and then got back up and looked at me, but this time, instead of 2 reddish-orange eyes, I saw 1, and then it ran into the swamp. For a couple of seconds I stood there in shock, and then I went towards my dog. I checked his pulse and he was still alive, so I picked him up and grabbed my guns and my phone and dialed 911 and started running towards my truck. The usual 1-hour walk turned into 30 minutes of non-stop running. When I arrived at my truck, the cops were there waiting, as well as an animal medical van. I let them take Django into the van while I talked to the police. When I told them what happened, the oldest-looking cop, who looked around 50, looked at me with a worried look and said, "Come show us your campsite." So I basically rushed to show them where the campsite was. When we got there, that thing was there, ripping through my tent. The oldest officer stopped and covered his mouth and gasped, which quickly caught its attention. It looked at us and roared, and then charged. By this time, with 3 pistols shooting at it, it quickly ran off, and we quickly packed up what wasn't ripped to shreds. We left as soon as we got back to the truck and cars. The van was gone and had left a note saying that they went to the emergency vet. Before we got on our way, the oldest cop looked at me and said in a sad, almost teared-up voice, "Son, please never come back here." And I swore that I wouldn't. For the past 6 years, I have not been back. And for those wondering, Django lived for a day before dying due to blood loss and an infection. It enrages me to think that if I hadn't been stupid and hadn't gone hunting, or if I would have gotten rid of those squirrel remains, Django would still be alive. Slumber Party from Hell from Sennia. When I was 8 years old, my mother remarried a local college professor, and we moved into his remodeled house on a dead-end dirt road that he shares with 3 other houses. Luckily, we were on the corner closest to a paved main street that led to a junior high, a small mall, and 2-screen movie theater. However, the very last house on the dirt road, about half a mile down from us, was an old, dreary, dilapidated patchwork house that sat perched at the edge of a very large swampy area and was surrounded on 3 sides by a deep, dark forest. That house always gave me the creeps, but the older couple that lived there, with their 2 sons and daughter, who was close to my age, were nice, so she and I became friends. A few years later, the daughter, Ellie, is turning 13 and begs me to attend her very first slumber party on the night of her birthday. I was a very shy, quiet, serious 12-year-old bookworm at that age, and I didn't really want to go, but my mother, fearing my lack of social life, insisted. If my ultra-religious mother only knew how many weird stories that family told about their resident ghosts, or the bizarre occult stuff Ellie's mother collected but kept hidden in a back bedroom, she would have never encouraged my friendship with Ellie, or even let me spend time with her family, so I never brought it up. The night of the early fall slumber party fell on a full moon, and even though it was a little chilly, her parents still insisted that we, a rowdy bunch of 7 adolescent girls, were all going to sleep in a large tent set up in the front yard next to the swamp, not far from the tree line. The party was kind of fun at first. We watched a couple of movies, played party games, did each other's hair, makeup, and painted our nails. We ate hamburgers, hot dogs, drank way too much soda, and enjoyed cake, ice cream, and opened Ellie's presents. Then about 10 or 11 o'clock at night, her parents gently pushed us outside to the tent, telling us that we could come in and quietly use the front bathroom or kitchen, but only if necessary. I don't remember who started it, but the next thing I knew, we were all huddled inside the dilapidated bathroom, lights off with 1 candle lit, and Ellie whispering, "Bloody Mary," into the mirror repeatedly. Of course, nothing happens, so the oldest girl, Ellie's 14-year-old cousin, decides that we are all going back out to the tent and brings along her aunt's Ouija board. I sit in the corner of the tent and watch the others all huddled around the board, knowing that my super strict mother and stepfather would flip out if I even touched it or participated in their game. Except, weird things do start to happen. Ellie and her cousin have their fingers on the planchette and ask a series of questions. Suddenly, it seems to answer, slowly moving itself from one letter to another letter, and spells out, "You called, they are coming." We all look at each other, completely flummoxed, and a few of the girls begin to nervously laugh. But then we all freeze when we see a couple of shadowy figures dart past the outside of the tent, and we hear a maniacal giggling. Of course, the other girls start to freak out and cry, and Ellie yells at them to shut up. "Please don't wake up my parents." But my insatiable curiosity gets the better of me, so I stand up and reach for the zipper to open the tent flap and look outside. The second that Ellie grabs my arm to stop me, we all seem to notice something else at the exact same moment. Not only is it suddenly freezing, and I mean ice cold, but the normally loud critters of the swampy forest who have been carrying on for hours under the full moon have gone completely silent. Not one croak can be heard, only the pounding of our hearts and the hyper-fast breathing coming from us as we stand there, gripping each other in abject terror. But then I do hear something. It's faint and far away at first, and I strain to listen, but very slowly it gets louder and louder and louder. There is heavy, plodding footsteps in the forest. Branches and twigs break under heavy feet. Tree limbs creak and swish as they're swept aside. I turn and look at the other girls, and they look absolutely horrified. Eyes like saucers, gasping breaths coming from wide-open mouths, pale, ghastly skin on their faces. They are all staring at the paper-thin walls, obviously hearing exactly what I'm hearing, and still seeing the now silent, shadowy figures dart around, only inches from where we huddle in the center. At that moment, my upbringing from a very long line of nurses kicks in, knowing that whatever is happening has to have a rational explanation, but is possibly dangerous. I know that I have to emulate my charge nurse mother and do something fast. So I force a laugh and loudly say, "Geez, Ellie, calm down. It's just your brothers being jerks and trying to scare us. If it was something bad, your dogs would be barking." They all look at me, take in a collective breath and slightly relax. But no, we all still hear those booming footsteps coming, getting even closer now, and impossible to ignore. So I pull Ellie forward and yell, "On 3, I'm pulling up the zipper and we are running into your house. Get ready." The second I yell 3, before the zipper is even halfway up, we're all shoving each other through and running back to the house as fast as we can, screaming for help the entire way. Right when Ellie's father swings the front door wide open, I hear Ellie's oldest cousin scream, "There's something in the woods!" Suddenly, several adolescent girls are screaming hysterically. The lazy old yellow labs finally start to bark, and her parents are yelling for an explanation. Of course, my curiosity gets the better of me again, and I whip around, standing half out of the doorway. Ellie's cousin is right. There is someone in the woods, not one, but 2. I see them, 2 giant hulking pure black shadow figures, just inside the tree line. Even though the moon is full, the mist and the fog have gotten much thicker, blanketing the swamp, the yard, and the tent, and it prevents me from seeing any details. All I can see are 2 huge dark shadow men standing there in the trees, staring at me and at the house. Suddenly I'm yanked back inside by Ellie's father, who slams the door shut. He's yelling at his 2 sons who are standing behind him, sleepy-eyed and confused, to get my damned shotgun. Ellie's mother is huddling around the other sobbing girls. Her graying hair in curlers, her nightgown rumpled, and she yells at me to get over here. But I run to the window as Ellie's father and brothers go charging out into the yard, yelling at the hulking figures who hadn't moved at all, just stood there unnaturally still, until the movement when Ellie's father actually fires off his shotgun directly at these things and at close range. But I can't even move because I see what happens. The moment Ellie's father fires, those men just disappear. They don't turn around and run. They don't come charging out to defend themselves. They just vanish into thin air, right before my eyes. And I know that Ellie's father and brothers see it too, based on the strange wide-eyed looks on their pale faces as they come barreling back through the door, bolting it behind them. As her parents try to resume some type of order in the chaos, we soon start hearing police sirens coming closer. Apparently, upon hearing all the screaming, dogs barking up a storm, and shotgun blasts, very old and grumpy Widow Smith and her son, up at the next house, call the police, who come to see what the ruckus is all about. The 2 police officers question us and Ellie's parents at length. They chalk the whole thing up to it just being a couple of drunk but curious vagrants who were coming out of the forest to see what all the hysterical young female screaming was about. They then assure all of us that they will send a couple of cars out to find the camp in the morning and move the vagrants on out of the area. The police officers refuse to even acknowledge anything we say about the Ouija board, the shadowy beings darting around the tent, the freezing cold, the sudden silence, or that the hulking shadow man just disappeared into thin air after being shot at with a shotgun. They admit that they don't see any footprints in the muddy ground, no blood, no broken branches, but then everyone but me suddenly seems happy to accept the given explanation of two drunk, curious vagrants in the woods playing weird games with several teenage girls who were trapped and terrified in a tent. After the officers leave, things do start to settle down. Ellie's mother starts cooking up an early breakfast and alarmed parents start to show up, including my mother, who left her night shift a little early to come get me. The next afternoon, I'm subjected to my own personal interrogation from my mother and stepfather. I leave out the weird stuff at first and just retell what the cops said. We were out in the tent, goofing around, and we thought we saw someone dart past the tent, and then heard people walking around towards us through the woods. So we panicked and ran back into the house, at which point her father and brothers charged outside and upon seeing two men in the forest fired at them, who then took off. But then my mother asks why she saw a Ouija board sitting on the kitchen counter when she came to get me. I break down under her terrifying gaze and admit everything. I truthfully assure her that Ellie and her cousin were the only ones who touched it. But after I also admit to the conversation about ghosts, spiritualism, and the occult I've overheard in the house, I am then banned from there, and my friendship with Ellie eventually breaks down. By the time next summer comes and school is out, Ellie's family moves away. The property is sold and the old house is demolished. The younger couple that build a new house there on the property are a little strange. They have lots of people over for bonfires regularly, but they also keep to themselves and don't bother getting to know any of their neighbors at all. And I don't go anywhere near that property, ever again.